Who can resist a fuzzy, snuggly flannel rag quilt? Oh my gosh, they're like a nice warm hug. You can hardly pass them up. When you see one, you've got to touch it. And I have made a lot of these, and I know the secrets. I'm going to share my 5 best secrets for mastering rag quilt techniques. I'm Leah Louise from Inspired Quilting by Leah Louise, and you're going to learn it all from putting your strips together, well, from cutting them first, and then we're going to put it together, and then we're going to add a border, and then clipping it. There's secrets every step along the way that's going to make this so much easier for you, and I can't wait to show you. Let's go ahead and get started. There's so much here to share. It may still be 90 degrees outside, but I want to get a bunch of baby quilts made that I can donate for fall. And I have my pink ones together. I've made a few of these, and now I'm going to work on the blues. And then I'm going to do some scrappy. Oh, I can't wait to show you that. That's something I've not done before. That's going to be fun. Scrappy rag quilts? Oh, yeah. But first, before we get into all that, what I want to show you are the ways that I've found to really cut back on time and how to make rag quilts faster and easier. Because when I make these, like I say, I donate a lot of these, and I want to, get them made in a short amount of time and be able to deliver them. They go to a food and clothing pantry here in town operated by our church. And so these are for a good cause. And I want to have quilts there available when it does start getting cold. And I mean, cold in Georgia isn't terribly cold, but we still need quilts. Now, what I want to show you are a couple of the methods that I use. Now, the first thing that I do is I use my width of fabric to its fullest advantage. And that means I cut strips from selvage to selvage, and then I just make long, narrow pieces, and I sew them together. And it really, really looks terrific. I like how these turned out. They're a lot of fun. We get a good ragged edge, and they're sweet. And I think that's going to be perfect for a little baby. And then there's a little bit bigger. Now this one is lightweight because I may have only used 2 layers, because you can use different counts of layers depending on what you want to do. Now this one is heavier, and sometimes it's a heavier flannel, sometimes it's that extra layer that I put in there, because I don't use batting anymore. I use an extra layer of flannel in the middle. 2 reasons. If I use the extra flannel in the middle, I get a much fuller frayed edge, which is what I love. Then what I do is I just go ahead and I put my 2 pieces together with a 3rd piece of flannel in the center. So that gives us some thickness. It gives us the fraying. And then I sew, depending on the size, I'll either sew down the center or down each side, but not over the seam allowance. I come in maybe 1 inch to 1.5 inches on each side. The advantage there is that it holds everything together. And if you've ever made a rag quilt with large pieces, like a large square, I'm speaking from experience here. And this one I had made with batting, and I didn't put the crisscross in there. I thought, I just need to go one way, and that'll hold the batting. Yeah, well, it held it one way, but the other way got all scrunched up. So if you hold it up to a window or to a light, you can see all these, batting clumps around where I stitched it, but the other corners are a little on the light side. There's nothing there, to give it any weight. So those are our TV quilts that we use at home. And those never go anywhere. Nobody ever sees them because they're also very ugly. But that's, we all have to start somewhere. And they were fun. I learned a lot, and I've come a long ways. Let's put it that way. So this is good. And you see, I also put a little border. So we're going to talk about borders on rag quilts. My concern when I make a rag quilt is that this edge will come apart. Now, I can't say that it's ever happened, but it could happen. And for me, putting just this little extra border makes it so much more secure, and I think it's going to hold up a lot, especially if you're making this for a little one. It's probably going to get washed a lot, and you want it to be pretty pretty durable. Now, here's one that has been clipped and hasn't been washed yet, so it needs to be frayed, but it just gives you an idea of how it looks before you wash it. And then this one, if you want to go bigger, instead of using strips, you can use blocks, but notice how they're offset. These seams don't line up, because what's one of the most difficult areas in a rag quilt is when you're putting two seams right here. So you've got, two seams going across each other with 4 squares, and there's just this big clump of knots and thread. It's difficult to sew because it's really, really thick, and after you wash it, it's all tangled. I offset it. This is a huge time saver. I also use the width of fabric in this case, and generally we're talking about a 40-inch piece, and I'll cut 4 10-inch squares. And then that's what I use, and you can see here that I do sew the X to hold all the fabrics together. So that's the first thing. Width of fabric is really important because it's a time saver, but it also saves fabric because you're using it all. There's very little waste. And I don't cut the selvages off until after the fact. And I'll do my sewing. I'll do this pre-quilting, so to speak, and then I'll come back and trim everything as I assemble my quilt. But let me show you now how we're going to get this cut, because there's a few things you can do along the way that's going to also help make your rag quilting faster. I'm really excited to be sharing all this with you, but I want to make sure that you don't miss out on the links below. Check below this video in the description, and you're going to find links on how to make a strip quilt like this, and also how to clip the seams when you're making your rag quilt. And that's really important because you want to make sure you get nice, fluffy, ragged seams between your strips of fabric. So make sure you get both of those. I'm also adding a link for an online course that I have. I have a course that I've taught how to do ruffled rag quilt borders. So if you like to do borders and you want to maybe take it a step further and get a little fancier, make sure you check that out. It's on sale, so I think you'll really appreciate that. All right, let's move on. We've got a lot to cover here today. The quickest and easiest way to cut your fabric for rag quilting is just go with the fabric. Decide what size block or strip you're going to use and keep it folded so you have your selvage and your fold on one side. When you fold this in half, it's going to measure approximately 21 inches, so your 24-inch ruler will work fine. Come in, line it up according to what you need, and you're good to go. Now, the advantage also, I use my 45 millimeter on this, which works great for a couple layers. But as I said, the advantage is you can layer multiple fabrics and cut them together at the same time. And if you use your larger blade, a 60 millimeter, you can go through 8 to 10 pretty easily, maybe 12. But when you're using flannel, it's thick and you may not get that full 12 or so layers. So you try and see what works for you. But if you have one of these, definitely give it a try because that is a time saver. So once I have all these together, I'm going to start sewing. But keep in mind that as you're cutting your fabric, not all fabrics are going to be the same width. So I have my selvage right here, and then I have another piece. I just want to show you, if I lay that on top, you see this is easily going to be an inch or more larger. And that's okay because we're going to start sewing at the selvage edge on every strip. And that way it'll be even along the one side where we begin. It'll be a lot uneven at the bottom, but that's okay. We can trim that after the fact. And then once you do this, go through, and if you have multiple sizes. So I'm doing these little, sort of like a sashing, a little mini border between my blocks. And these I've cut in multiple strips. So the easiest way, selvage to selvage, do your width of fabric, and that's going to be quick. If you're going to do squares, then we can come back and cross cut them, and we're going to talk about that another time because that's the next quilt. But right now we are going fast and furious, and this is the way to go. Sewing your rag quilt requires lots of fabric being sewn at once. And if that's something you're not accustomed to, I'm going to share a couple ways that will help. You can try it the way you sew everything else, and then you'll find out what problems may occur. But first, let's talk about the walking foot. I never do a rag quilt without using a walking foot. And it's these little feed dogs underneath that make the difference. So you can see, there it is right there. So there's an arm as you load this into your machine. This is where it's going to sit on your underneath your needle. But this arm right here, and it usually has a fork in it that's going to go around the thumb screw that holds your needle, so that as your needle goes up and down, it's lifting these top feed dogs. So you know, on the bottom, as you're sewing, you've got the feed dogs that come up and they pull your fabric through. And that's great when you have a couple of light layers of fabric. But when you're using multiple layers of thick fabric, those feed dogs are only working on the bottom, and these top fabrics aren't going to go at the same rate. Chances are the regular presser foot is just going to glide across these, and that's going to tend to stretch it. So when you get down to the end, you may find that one piece is much longer than the other. Now you can see these two blue ones are pretty much the same distance. I did one without the walking foot, I think, in the beginning, and we'll find that here somewhere. I may have already sewn it, but that's the problem I found in the first, rag quilts that I made, is how off my seams always were. And that is because of the lack of a walking foot. If you're going to do a lot of rag quilts, it's worth the investment. If your machine didn't come with it, because most machines do, especially if you buy a machine geared towards quilting, it'll have the 1/4 inch seam allowance foot and a walking foot. But these are available as a universal model, and it'll list, this will fit machines that are whatever. And so I'll put some links below. So if you're interested in a walking foot, you can find out where to get that. So we've got our walking foot, and we're going to begin sewing. We're going to take our fabrics and just stack them by the machine. And what I'll do is I'll pick up my first fabric, my center fabric that you're not going to see. This is what I'm using in place of batting, and then my back fabric. And for me, I make the front and back the same. It's easier because then I don't have to worry about what is the back going to look like, because it's going to look exactly like the front. So that all works really well. Now, I will sit down and I'll just have my stacks of fabric, and I'll pick up one strip at a time. I'll align them as I go, and I sew. And I want to sew one side of all 3 layers together. And I'm going to take a little more than a 1/2 inch. And in a rag quilt, you always want to go with a 1/2 inch seam, not a typical 1/4 inch for your regular quilting, but you want that 1/2 inch because you're going to come in and clip these in order to get that frayed edge. So you're going to come in, and I'm going to tell you, I took this a little bit bigger than the 1/2 inch seam and realized after the fact I really didn't need to, because this is narrow enough. I don't have to worry about it shifting once I have it sewn. The reason I do this pre-stitching before I sew it together to another strip is these 3 layers are going to be added to another 3 layers on top, and somewhere in there something is going to shift. If I have this sewn and it's all in place, I can come back and add the 3 layers that are not sewn right on top, and everything's going to stay together. So I just find this will save me time, because I don't have to worry about my strips being misaligned or something folded over or getting stretched or twisted. it's easy for me to go through and spend a few extra minutes of sewing this. So we talked about the walking foot and how effective that is. The other thing you want to think about is your needle. You always want to start your quilts with a new needle, because once it gets dull, you're going to be poking holes in your fabric. The needle's not going to be effective. Your machine's going to work harder, and it's just not going to be as clean a process. Now, I tried something new. I sometimes do quilting, different sewing, where I'll use the adhesive, the steam-a-seam, particularly when I'm doing like artsy quilts or collage and things like that. And so I have to be careful when I'm applying those products that I use a hot iron to melt everything and get everything to adhere together. And I still sometimes will get problems with stickiness on my needles. I found a non-stick needle, and this is by Schmetz. These are the brand needles that I use. And what I love about these, I think you can see in the package, is this non-stick makes them so incredibly smooth. And so I had put them in, I forget what I was making, I was doing something, and I was doing a collage actually, and so I wanted to use these, and they work great. It didn't, and nothing stuck to it. It's, it's not Teflon. I think Teflon we can't use anymore, but this one worked really good, whatever that surface is. And so I just left it in my machine, because after I was finished with it, it was plenty sharp enough. So I went on sewing and sewed a few more quilts. This thing is fantastic. It lasts a really long time. And so I was able to sew quite a few quilts using this same needle. And so it's the Schmetz Super Non-Stick Needles. And they come in a 5-pack. You can obviously buy bundles of more. And it's a size 14. Now, I generally sew my quilts with a 10 or 11. But when I'm doing rag quilts, because it's so much fabric and it's a heavier flannel, I'll use a 14. Now, if I'm doing blue jeans as a rag quilt, I'll use the 16. But I haven't tried this on the denim yet, and I certainly will, and I'll let you know, because these are awesome. I really loved it. Okay, I've got another new toy. I just was trying to find things that are time savers. And I have heard people talk about pre-wound bobbins. And I thought, okay, come on, really? We can't wind our bobbins? Well, then I found out this is like a spool of thread in that it is professionally wound. And look how tight and close those threads are. So I don't have the problem, and I don't know if this is something that happens to you, but with my machine, when it winds the bobbin, sometimes that thread kind of crosses over, and it's a little lumpy and bumpy. It's not nearly this smooth. And why does that matter? Because they can put on so much more thread. I cannot tell you how far one of these bobbins will go. And I got the black and white just to try it, and you can see I've only used a couple, but man, these are great. So if you use a lot of neutrals for your piecing and even for your quilting, like on your quilt back, use a bobbin like this, you're going to love it, because you'll be changing your needle, changing your bobbin far less. So those are a couple new things that I just started using that I am really happy with. All right, so let's get on to our quilting here. Our rag quilt is going to start coming together. Step 1 was making all these strips, and I just chain piece them and I put them through, and you can see there's quite a few of them here, and I make one end always even with all the fabrics, because when I go to do my trimming, I'm going to have all these sewn to one side of my quilt, and then this other side is what's going to be trimmed off. That way it just makes it easier. There's less trimming all throughout my quilt. I'm kind of prioritizing. All right, then I start doing the same thing here. What I'll do is I'll take my wider strips, and same like I did with this, I'll put one in the front and the back, and then I put my piece of flannel in the center, and this I did the same, and I just came straight down just a little bit more than ½ an inch. And I only need to do one side, and I'm going to show you why. So I went through and I did this again, front and back, and I just chain stitch. And I just ran everything through. And when I got to the end, then I did the next step. And that's to add our little mini border onto our quilt, or onto our strip. So we're going to take our wide border and put it to the bottom with a cut seam over here. Now, I'm not going to, let me put that way. I said cut seam. I meant the sewn seam. That didn't even make sense, did it? All right. So what I'm going to do is I sew this and I sew down one side. Then I'm going to come back and put my narrow border on the wide strip. But what I want you to see is this is the sewn seam and this is the sewn seam. Now, I did put these on top of each other, and I did a test strip just to make sure everything stayed put. But because this piece is sewn and this piece is sewn, everything pretty much stays together, because flannel's not a slippery fabric. That little fuzz kind of holds things together. So I went through and I got all my strips, and now I'm going to show you one other little step we're going to take. So I kind of work through various steps along the way instead of saving everything for the same time. Flannel can get heavy and it can get hot. And if I do all my strip piecing at once, I'm going to have a huge pile in my lap and it could get uncomfortable. But next we're going to clip. And I'll tell you, if you save all your clipping to the end, your hands are going to be tired. Let me show you what I do instead. Here's another tool I really recommend if you're going to rag quilt. If you're going to make a lot of these, and the reason I like to use these and I make these, especially for charity or donation quilts, they're fast. They're fast, but they're pretty. They feel nice. They're warm and fuzzy. And everybody loves a rag quilt. There's just something really nurturing about them. You wrap up and you just feel good. And it's like a nice warm hug, and that's what a quilt's supposed to be, right? So that means there's a lot of fabric here. Now, cutting 3 layers of fabric is a lot. But when you get into cutting 6 layers, oh my goodness, that's a lot of fabric you need to go through. I'm trying to find the end here. So what I do is I use my rag quilting clippers or snippers. They're called different things. What I appreciate is this little clasp because it keeps it closed. Now, why is there a spring? I want to show you. When you use your regular scissors, let me grab a pair. Here's a regular pair of shears. Oh, look at that. This is my other spring-loaded. Okay, we'll show you this too. When you use regular scissors, your scissors close, but then you have to use your thumb to open them, right? Down and up. Now, this thumb gets really tired of constantly lifting those scissors open. So you have to lift this little part up here to lift your scissor to move on to the next. So you can buy these, and these are really nice. I like them, but they're more expensive. They're probably about twice the price of the other ones. But they're gingers, so they stay sharp for a really long time, and I appreciate that. Now, this has a little lever that keeps it closed. You can see it stays closed, but when it's open, it automatically springs. This has a built-in spring, so as I'm cutting, it's going to open. So let me show you here. I'm just going to start right here. I'm going to clip in, and look at how that just pops open. So this saves all kinds of wear and tear on your thumb. There was a point in time when I would actually take like the blue painter's tape and I'd wrap it around my thumb and wear a glove over it, like, either a quilting glove or just a rubber glove, and just to protect myself from getting blisters, because and that was also when I did all the clipping at one time. So I've learned a lot, let me tell you. Everything I'm telling you here is from experience. But if you try and, spend an hour or two doing this, if you have a really large quilt, that's going to get tiresome. Now, this works the same way. These have a spring in the center, and it actually comes out. So you just need to be careful. I mean, it doesn't come out easily, but if you drop them or whatever, these can come out, and all you do is put it back onto those little pieces, those prongs that are protruding out, and you're good to go. Whoops, there we go. So this is how it works, and it does basically the same thing, and it's just a matter of what you're comfortable with holding in your hand. Now, this I think is probably quicker for small projects because it's a smaller piece to hold, and you can move it along a little more quickly. I find, I do go quicker with these, but I do love my big ones for the bigger projects because it's really effective. So when I sewed my pieces together, I have this wide one and my small narrow strip, and there were 6 loose pieces. Actually, excuse me, there were 3 loose pieces on the bottom, and I put my 3 on top that had already been sewn together. And in doing that, everything stayed terrific. So the idea is have at least one of the pairs that you're sewing together to join the seam have a pre-sewn, like it's been pre-basted. And you can certainly use a basting stitch. When I sew my rag quilt, I do lengthen my stitch from a 2.5 to a 3.0. So just 1 notch up, just because you're going through so much more fabric, it's thicker, you don't want to put too much tension on your thread that it can break. And of course, always use your cotton threads. Whoops. And so here we are. We just kind of work our way through, and I will go through all my strips and sew my wides and narrows. And now, if all the strips are going to be the same size, then I would just take these and sew them together. And let me see, find something I can use to cut with here. I got all kinds of utensils, but nothing, there we go, is open. So I have one side that's sewn and this side is sewn. So what I would do is I think it's easier to put the pre-sewn side down and then put the loose side on top. Line your selvages at whatever your starting edge is, and then just start sewing. Now, that worked for me. You're going to try and see what works for you, because everything can be a little bit different depending on your machine, how you handle it, what you're accustomed to. But using the concept of these ideas is really going to help you to, get your rag quilting going. And I got some folding over I need to take care of while I was sewing. So I have my strips cut. I have my first basting, so to speak, but my first joining of these 3 pieces, which is the front, the back, and the center, which is going to help thicken up my frayed edge as well as, thicken the quilt all together. And now I'm going to go through and clip everything. Once that's done, I'm going to take my pieces and start putting them together. And so, let's see. I can do it this way. So we'll have a dark with the border, and then I'll have a light one with the border, and I'll just go through. So this border, you can just go straight strips, same size. I like the idea of putting something in there, and it just sort of jazzes it up. This is going to be 40 inches wide, and if I just use 5-inch squares, it would probably be like probably about 40 inches thereabouts. So it'd be relatively square. But adding this, I just think is fun. It makes it more attractive, and I just like it. So that's where I go. And, I hope you know that all you need to do is take what you like best of what I'm doing and apply it to yours. I'm not telling you what to do. I'm just giving you some ideas to help you improve your rag quilting and get the finishes that you want. Now, I have tutorials for all this down below. From how to make an easy flannel strip quilt, I have a tutorial on that. And then the other one is how to clip your seams, because when you have places where your seams join or intersections or the edges, if you don't clip it, especially on the corners, if you don't clip it in a particular manner that's consistent and works throughout, you're going to end up with a lot of knotting. And, you know, after you wash your quilt, because that's how you get the frayed edges, is washing it all out, you get these big bundle of knots, and I don't like that because it just looks messy. And then you have to go back and trim it, and you got to try not to cut your fabric. All that stuff becomes problematic, and I like to quilt with ease. So there we are. We've got a bunch of fabric going and sewing and clipping, and I'm going to kind of catch myself up here and show you how we put this all together with a border. That's the big thing. I want to show you how to make a border. All right, we're going to take a look at the good, the bad, and the ugly. Sometimes it happens. Overall, I love it. It's coming out great. It really, really is. And I really like the strips where they have the dark solids in between the colors. I don't know, are you seeing the problem yet? As I'm adding these, so the first pair, when I sewed the little narrow strip to the large one, I clipped those. And then I sewed it to the next one. I haven't clipped these yet. And you can decide whether you want to clip it as you go or do it after the fact. This is a small enough quilt that I'm not too worried about it. Now, when I was sewing this kind of a pre-seam, basting seam, for me it was just the secure seam to hold the layers together. I went in a little more than the 1/2 inch, which is fine, because that's how I think I showed you on this one. I do the same thing, and you can see on the back I come in from the seam into the strip-aways, and that sort of holds everything in place, and it looks good. But I used matching thread. I did not even think about, I didn't have navy blue thread, or even this royal blue, so I just thought, oh, black will work. Well, yeah, it'll work, but it's a bit on the visible side. It's not real bad, but yeah, I could have done better had I thought it through, which I didn't, unfortunately. But that's okay. It's not going to be noticed, and you know, nobody's going to go and say, oh, look, that's the wrong color thread. So that's that. Let's see. I want to make sure I have this one. Okay, this isn't the one I made the mistake on. That's why I can't find it. Ah, here it is. Oh my gosh, I can't believe I did this. And so I'm lining up my strips as I'm sewing them together because I want one end to kind of be even, so when I go to trim it, I'm not wasting too much fabric. And so I got here and I thought, oh, that's not going to work. I have to flip it over. Well, when I flipped it over, the seam went on this side. So my clip seam is on the back instead of the front. And I thought, you know, I'm just going to cut another piece and I'll start over because that's going to be a pain in the neck to cut. But, you know, it really isn't. I started and it comes apart very easily. So I'm just going to pull that off and re-sew it on. But I like to show you the mistakes that can happen because you need to watch for it. And, you know, you're going along and you're just cruising and it's going great. And then all of a sudden you look at it and go, something isn't right. Well, it happens. And you just step back, take a deep breath, go find a little bonbon, a cup of tea, whatever it takes, and then come back to it and take care of it. But I'm really liking how this is coming out. So this is what it's going to be, is I have the dark there, and then I'll repeat this dark and the light. So I have these two more pieces to put on. And then I'm going to put this blue strip on each of the sides. So it'll sort of create the look of a border. And I think it's going to be wonderful. So I'm not too far from it. It's just, you know, the ripping out and having the do-overs. Oh my gosh, those slow you down. But that's okay. It's looking terrific. I really like how it's coming out. All my strips are put together, and I'm just having you take a look at the back just so you can see how it lays out. And I really like that extra little blue between the wider strips. I just think it looks nice. So what I need to do is trim this edge off so I can use a nice straight edge here to put the border on. So I have my strips on each end that I included as I was sewing along. But now I need to trim this back and cut off the selvages. So the first thing is I want to lay it nice and flat, and get it straight, sort of straighten it up with the grid on each side so it's not wonky. And then you kind of get an idea of where it is. Now, I need to cut below the selvage. And so these are my lowest selvages here. So I know I need to cut there and there. And this is a 36-inch ruler. I bought this when I bought my large cutting mat. And it's great for trimming quilts. It just gives me so much more room. Okay, so a couple things that you want to do is get underneath the selvage. The reason we have to cut selvages off in general is it's woven different than the rest of the fabric. It's much tighter. And for quilting, that's going to be very evident. But more so with rag quilting, because if you leave that in there, it's not going to fray. So we want to make sure that's going to come off. So I just kind of look across, but then I want to make sure that my lines are straight. So see how these lines fall pretty straight with the seams? And so that tells me that I'm pretty much going to be spot on. And this is something else for rag quilts. Now, we generally use a 45 millimeter for cutting. The 60 is great when you're going through more layers or heavy layers. And I just find this to be very helpful in my my rag quilt projects. So I'm just going to go from here. Whoop, do I have a pin in there? Nope. Just really thick. Okay. And I'll go about as far as I can. And I'm just going to slide my ruler over. And I'm going to keep it in line with this. And I'm just going to come and trim off the edge here, making sure that this is a straight side over here. There's no twisting or angling. So I'll do the same on this one. So I'll just kind of line that up so I see it's with the grid and line this up. It kind of helps at this point just to make sure that you're going to be nice and square. And then we're going to put this on the cut and see how that edge lines up with the straight line in the ruler. And so I know I am pretty good to go. And that's that. So now I'm just going to take my other piece of the blue strip and put it around the edge like I've done here and here. And then that's going to give me a border around the whole thing. So let me get that done. And this quilt is finished. It's come along really well. Despite my my challenges along the way, I think it's turned out great. And I have my ends all sewn on, my border ends with lots of extra thread. But what I want to show you is how to clip this. Now, the first thing I want you to notice is that when I sew this piece on, my border, that I make sure these seams are open. And that just makes it smoother, easier. We don't have lots of big clumps. And then we're going to be able to clip it easier this way, too. So the first thing I'm going to do is when I have a long seam like this, I'm going to clip it right next to where the seam is, sewing those two pieces down. Now, a lot of times what I'll do is when I'm clipping these long pieces is I'll leave, you know how I clip ahead of time before I add, you know, I clip along the way just to make sure I don't have so much at the end to deal with. It's good to leave maybe, 2 inches unclipped. That way when you go to sew it, it could be easier. So if you have trouble and notice that it is twisting or clumping or folding over as you sew, you may want to leave a little more space when you add that final border. So right here we're going to come in and we're going to sew along that seam line right there. Okay, the seam goes from side to side, so I'm going to clip from the side in. That way these clips are all in the same direction. Okay, I want them to come where I'm cutting to the seam. Now up here, if I cut right here, there we go. I need to be careful because if I cut the same way from here to here, then if I cut here, I'm going to cut all that out. It disappears. So if I come in and I put a clip here, and then I clip it this way, you see what I'm talking about? That little square gets cut out completely. So I come in sideways, but here I come in vertically. And I just come in on either side of that seam. See how great these things are? They just cut right through it. And then I'll cut maybe once more, and then on the edge. So here's the edge of my seam, and then I'll clip once in the middle. And that way, there's more clipping that's going to allow more of the thread to slip out as we're sewing. Now see here, this one, when I was pre-clipping these, not all of them were the same length. So if I clipped too far up, then I've got my cuts really close to the edge. But what I can do is fold that over and then just cut the back piece like that. Okay, so if you've got this cut sideways, again, see, if I were to come in and clip right here, these pieces would come off and then there'd be no frayed edge. So I'll just roll that over and I'll just come in and I'll do this. So you can cut it either way. It's probably easiest to leave some space here because then it becomes easier to sew. And these are all, they were clipped pretty close, but they're not going to get clipped off. And that's one thing that I just double check with each seam as I'm clipping it to make sure that I'm not losing anything. So then once you get those, and I kind of go through the row and I'll do all the seams at one time, because then once I get the seams done, it's just easy just to go through real quick like that. What I want to show you is the corner. So when we come in, we have this row already on, and then we're going to come across and sew this one. And okay, so it's sewn open, but we're going to sew it this way. So we're going to go all the way from end to end, and that seam's going to be up. Now, this is also going to be an outer edge on our border. So once I have this attached, I come through and I sew, a 1/2 to 5/8 inch all the way around the outer edge, sewing these seams open, just like I do along the other seams. And so these need to be clipped. But what I want to make sure is that this seam is held really well. So I'll go through and I'll double sew that. I will sew around once, then I'll come back around one more time. It just reinforces it. Is it critical? No. You can, choose to do that or not, but it works really well for me, and I think it adds another level of security of holding things together. I do that extra bit just because I tend to worry about, things coming apart. Nothing's worse than thinking a quilt's going to, disassemble itself or a seam pull loose. I just like to make sure it's secure, that it's held together well. So here we're going to do this the same way. So we're going to cut close to the seam on each side, once in the middle on each side, and then come out to the edge. And so this is clipped really well. Now in here, because we have this row already clipped, we have this edge that we need to do. Now remember, here we clipped into the seam. Here we're also going to clip into the seam. So we're going to tuck in really close, and we're going to come in on this side really close, and then I can trim these this way. Now it just so happens that because this is a narrow border, that seam allowance is really close. So what I'm going to do is come in and clip these. So I'm going to, that seam's coming loose a little bit, but that's okay. This cross seam here is going to hold everything. And when I clip it, then that's going to fray and it's going to lock itself in place. So clip on each side, one in the middle, one on the edge. Come over here, one in the middle, and one on the edge. And I just want to make sure I'm not losing anything anywhere. Okay, so there we are. And then now I would come across here. I'd come to this seam, cut it in the middle, and just work my way across. Whoop, that little piece is folding over. I need to get my hand under. There we are. Okay. Just wanted to curl around. And so you just do that all across. And once it's clipped, that was a particularly wide one, just work your way through to the other side. Now, that's done all the way around. It's the corner that you do a little different, the outer corner. And the reason being is if I clip this just the way we were doing over here, number one, I can't clip this way and this way. So we're going to do it at an angle. We don't want all the thread to get caught around this corner, and then it creates, a bundle of knots. So I come in, I just take that little tip of the corner off. You see that? There's not much. And then I will come in, and it's boxed in by the seams on each side because I sew all the way off, and I'm going to cut on this side of the seam here and here. I'm not going all the way in because I don't want to lose this. And then I'm going to cut here on each side. And then I'm going to put one little cut in the center. So this is now nice and frayed. And you're going to get a really good corner right there. So let's do one more just so you can see that. So on the outer one, oh, talking about threads. Oh, I'm glad I saw this. Threads, clip them along the way and clip them close, because these threads are a different weight, they're a different wind, and they're going to show up if you leave them in your seam. So if you have loose threads and you're clipping along and there's loose threads that hang out beyond your seam allowance, they're going to be very, very visible. So make sure you trim your threads as you go. Okay, first thing we're going to cut is this corner right there. Whoops, get it in there. Okay, now we're done. That's all you need to do, and it goes really quick. We're going to clip this side. Whoop, got to hang on to it. Then we'll clip this side, and just a short little one in the center, just to loosen up those threads. And that's it. Now all we need to do is wash our quilt to get all the threads out and run it through the dryer. Now, I recommend washing using a double rinse cycle. That way you get most of the threads out. And when you tuck this in the dryer, run it for like maybe 10 or 15 minutes and clean out your lint trap, because you might get a lot of excess thread in there and it could, get really hot with all that lint. You want to make sure that you get that cleaned out, and then again, clean it when you're finished. And that's it. So let me show you what this looks like finished. I think it's going to be beautiful. Thanks so much for joining me today. I know this got really long. Thanks for hanging in there. But there's just so much to cover, and I get so excited when I do rag quilts. They are so much fun. So I hope you give it a try. If you have any questions, let me know. But I think you'll find that they really are quite an easy quilt. And it's probably not a bad place to start for a beginner, or if you just need a quick quilt in a hurry. But I do want to thank you for being here. It is always a pleasure sharing my quilts with you. Have a fantastic rest of your day.